Hey, good morning. I'm Hal Brainerd, and Aaron Ingram is here with me doing the video part of this. The first lesson that we brought to you was discussing the relationship between your shutter speed and your f-stop. Now remember, if you have that little tiny aperture, which is a big number, but if you have that little tiny aperture letting in a tiny bit of light, you've got to have a longer shutter speed. What we're going to talk to you today is a third part of this sequence, and that's your ISO, which is basically a setting that allows you to decide how quick you want the image sensor to be absorbing the light, I can't, pardon me?
Collecting.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. How fast your image sensor is collecting the light. So I like to use a very small ISO of about 100 because I make very large prints. I don't want the noise to start showing up. I think a lot of people, the average person, probably prefers an ISO of around 400, and that's fine. But you really, once you start hitting those really high numbers, you're going to see the noise in your picture. If you're using it just for the internet, that's probably not a problem at all. You know, if you think of the extreme, it becomes a little easier to make an example. I went to Glacier National Park and I wanted to photograph the Milky Way. But what I found was that if I put my camera on the fastest ISO I had and put it at a 30th of a second, as wide open an aperture as I could get, as big an aperture, physical aperture as I could get, which is a small number, it was still a tiny bit underexposed. So I did shoot it at 30th of a second. I was satisfied with it. But being a little underexposed, I had to make corrections for that in Camera Raw before I went into Photoshop. And it worked out great. It looked very nice. So there's your ISO. You're not going to change it very often, so don't start getting it confused with your shutter speed and f-stop, which you will change a lot. You know, the other thing we'd like to discuss with you today is your color temperature. Yeah, the color temperature is really important. You want your red apple to be a red apple. You don't want it to be some other color. So I'd like to talk about film very briefly, and you don't have to remember all this that I'm talking to you about film, but it will help you understand color temperature better. Because in the film days, we had to pick the correct film for the color temperature that we were shooting under. If you were going to be indoors, you had to get an incandescent film so the color indoors would look right. If you were going out into the sunlight, you had to have a daylight or outdoor film. Color temperature is measured by the Kelvin scale. And as the sun passes through the sky, it changes, the color temperature changes constantly. It's changing every day, every minute, every season. And if you don't have the right color temperature, you're not going to have a red apple. In the film days, we had an American standard. The ASA is what this film speed was called, not ISO. Well, that's because the people making the film had to be sure that when you were photographing a red apple, it was the same color when it was printed as the red apple you photographed. So they picked out a day in July, and I wish I remembered the day, but I don't. But a day in July in Washington, D.C., at 12 o'clock noon, if there were no clouds in the sky, and you took a picture of a red apple, it would come out pretty much looking like that red apple. Now, of course, it's not perfect. You still have to go in and do a little processing. But if you're not very good at changing color when you're processing or adjusting color when you're processing, it's a whole lot easier to adjust if you're pretty darn close to begin with. So if there is a cloud in the sky, that's going to make it a little cooler. If you're in the shade of a building, that makes it a different color temperature. So you'll have all these different settings on your camera that you can set to make the color more correct when you get into your final processing.
Now, if you're a beginning photographer, you may not know exactly what setting to use for a particular situation, but the digital camera really makes it easy for you. It's got all kinds of different settings to adjust your white balance, and this is your color temperature. So the first thing we have here is AWB, and that's another way of saying automatic white balance. So if you're really good at color correction, in post, you can use the automatic white balance setting, and it will get pretty close to the particular situation you may be in. And then in post, you can just color correct. But if you're not as good at that, you can go through the different settings. The first setting we have is sunlight. The next setting is the shade of a building. Now that's different than the setting of cloud cover because your cloud cover will cast more of a blue tint. So you want to make that distinction. The next thing we have here is incandescent, and the next thing is fluorescent. So if you're indoors and you have fluorescent lighting or incandescent lighting, you can make that distinction. And the next thing is for the flash. If you have a flash on, you can adjust for that. And the next thing we have here is custom color balance. You can set a white piece of paper in front of your camera, and this setting will help you adjust and get the correct white balance for any kind of lighting situation, except mixed lighting conditions. And the last thing we have here is Kelvin. So if you have a color temperature meter, the Kelvin setting will help you adjust for the white balance. Kelvin is measured in numbers. It will give you a number if you have a color temperature meter. So you can dial in the correct number and then get the correct white balance. And that's by far the most precise way to go. Well, we want to thank you all so much for watching this video today. Be sure to subscribe and share. Tell your friends about our channel if they're interested in photography, because Hal is a wealth of knowledge and there's going to be more content coming. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.